To quote Thomas Jefferson, a well-informed citizenry is the best defense against tyranny. Welcome to the Constitution Solution, one podcast under God, where we discuss the basics of our constitutional republic and how our freedoms are being seized by public officials, both elected and unelected. I'm Mark DeLuzio, a former candidate for the U.S. Congress and a Gold Star father. Join me as we learn together how we can save this unique experiment that we call America. Hi, episode 50, Constitution Solution, one podcast under God. This episode is going to be called, Do We Have a Government Framework That We Can Count On? Kind of an important question, from administration to administration. Yeah, sure. Each administration is going to have different policies and, different programs they want to, instill on us and push and all that. But the fundamental framework of our government as laid out by the U.S. Constitution seems to be something you cannot count on from one administration to the other. So where does that leave us Americans? Where does that leave us corporations, businesses, citizens who are trying to plan their lives, plan their business, and have at least something to count on that's going to be a constant? So I want to talk about a few things that are problematic here, because it almost seems as if our Constitution is kind of like a variable plaything that we can manipulate based on our political desires, our quest for power, our appeasement to certain interest groups and things like that. And I want to start by something that we all should not have to question, and that's the rule of law. I think you could see that crime has been an unbelievable problem during this past Biden administration. A lot of that, of course, has to do with the immigration issue of letting in some 12 to 20 million people, depending on who you want to listen to. And we know that a lot of these countries did not send us their best. They sent us prisoners. We have these gang members. We have all kinds of problems coming into our country. And I have no idea how we're going to ever rid ourselves of the of the corruption that got allowed to come into our country unchecked. Okay, but that rule of law has much more to it than just opening up our borders so that the Democrats can get votes. Okay, which is one of the ultimate objectives of that whole border policy, or lack thereof. But if you think about it, if you think about the Communist Manifesto, if you think about the notion that people were in prison, according to Karl Marx, because they had no choice but to steal, they had no choice but to cheat and commit crimes, because the wealthy, or what he called the bourgeoisie, took advantage of the proletariats, the working class, and they had no choice. So you start seeing that Marxist attitude with states letting people out of prison, not prosecuting people, allowing people to go free, very light prison sentences by these judges. Okay. California introduces hey, you could steal up to $950 and not be prosecuted. Where does that come from? Stores in San Francisco, marquee stores like Nordstrom's, closing their doors in the city of San Francisco because it's untenable in terms of how to do business there. So this whole notion of a a rule of law that we as citizens should count on is gone. Police are still told to stand down as people burn buildings and burn police stations, of all things. People are being, murdered, raped, kidnapped, and police are told to stand down. The New York City cop that got thrown ice water on him, that's assault, okay? But he was told to stand down. So we can't count on a rule of law anymore. And when you do try to take law into your own hands and protect your own property, you get prosecuted. So that's a real problem. And that's something that the founding fathers said, hey, if we don't have a rule of law, this country doesn't work. This country doesn't work at all. And sure enough, that's what's going on today. Now let's talk about some of our laws. Title 8. I talked a lot about Title 8. It's our immigration law. A lot of people, Title 8 never comes up, hardly ever. I only hear it once in a while. But Title 8 is a very rigid set of laws. I did an episode on this a while back, and I won't go through all the different, attributes, but the President of the United States takes an oath to uphold our Constitution. And in our Constitution is a supremacy clause that says these are the laws of the land. Okay. And you take an oath whether you like the law or not. You have to enforce them. That's not your job to determine which laws you like as commander in chief to decide what you're going to enforce or not. Well, Title 8 was a clear example of where they just looked the other way on these laws. How can you plan? How can you even know who's in your neighborhood? And then you get sanctuary cities that say, we're not going to follow Title 8. We're not going to follow the immigration laws. And they get away with it. How could they get away with coming out with a policy that says we are not going to follow federal law? They're violating the supremacy clause in the Constitution right off the bat. So now you're living in these cities where there's not that constant, consistent rule of law that you can count on anymore. Okay? What about tax law? How can you plan your business or your retirement when the laws are always changing, depending on whatever agenda that administration happens to have? Okay? Let's just take capital gains. That's kind of a big deal for business to be able to predict what their future is going to be like relative to capital gains, and don't want those rules changing in the middle of the investment, if you will, that makes the justification of that investment totally inadequate, right? I mean, the Biden administration wanted to tax unrealized capital gains. Thank God Harris didn't get in. Unrealized capital gains means that if you bought an asset, let's say a house, for $500,000, and in 1 year it appreciated to, let's say, $600,000, these yo-yos wanted you to pay tax on that $100,000 gain. Where would you come up with the money? If you're in the 30% tax bracket, you have to come up with $30,000. This is what these people wanted to do with the tax law. They want to change the capital gains rates. We had the highest tax rate in the nation, in the world, I should say, for corporations. It was at 35% until President Trump brought it down to 21%. And the reason companies leave America and go to China and produce over there is not because of the labor rate. It's because high taxes, 35%, and regulations, unbelievably oppressive regulations that are put on this by these administrative agencies, most of which are unconstitutional. So depending on since these agencies report into the executive branch, and for those of you out in Rio Linda, that's the president, okay? God bless Rush Limbaugh. You don't know what regulations are going to be placed in on by whatever whim a president has, since these agencies report to him. And because these agencies write regulations that have the power of a law, there's really no difference. You could be prosecuted, you could be jailed, they could take your property, they can fine you. These are not laws that our representatives in Congress passed. These are laws that are being encouraged, if you will, by the executive branch. So now we got the president writing law. So right there, our constitutional framework of checks and balances, and where one branch writes law, is gone. How can you plan? How can you even have faith in your government that whatever's happening today is going to change? I mean, all these things that President Trump is doing, and I support most of them, could be gone in a heartbeat with the next administration just by an executive order. Never mind the law, right? So all these things. Think about retirement. What if some yo-yo president wanted to change the 401k plans, and all of us that have 401ks, now everything becomes taxable, or whatever other kind of scheme they want to put in place. There's no framework again for us to even plan our future. All right, estate planning. Still have an estate tax. How do you plan for that? And even at the state level, you don't know what's going to happen at the state level. I live in a state right now that doesn't have an estate tax. What if they decide to put one in? I never would have moved here if I knew that. Okay. So you see what I'm saying? It's hard to plan as Americans. Now let's take the Federal Reserve. And there's so much to say about the Federal Reserve, but the fact that they control interest rates and the money supply means that they control the economy. You want to buy a house, but interest rates are now 7% on a mortgage, 8%, and it takes everybody, so many people, out of the home buy-in market because of that. Okay, we have no control over that. All right, a lot of social engineering going on with the federal government. I happen to know a very reputable and well-known gun company. The owner called me up and told me, Mark, you have to come help us because the Federal Reserve placed an edict on the banks, which, by the way, are all stockholders into the Federal Reserve. They're required to be shareholders. It's a nice little gig they got over there, the Federal Reserve. And I've talked a lot about the Fed, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it today, but this is what happened. To push the social engineering anti-Second Amendment agenda of the administration, okay, of the Biden administration, they told their member banks that if you're loaning to a gun company, you're going to lose your prime rate. So this particular gun company got a call from their bank saying, hey, by June, we're going to have to drop you a line of credit. And this company had no way to pay people. Okay. That's what's going on here. How can you actually count on anything when this kind of crap is going on? Okay. And God help us if we ever get digital currency, because then all of us will be controlled by the Federal Reserve. And I'm not kidding you. I mean, you think about this. They can come to you and say, you need to spend $10,000 by September 1st, or we're going to wipe it out of your bank account because we want to stimulate the economy and we want you to spend money. Or conversely, they can actually come back and say to you, hey, we're going to put $10,000 in your bank account so that you could spend it, which means they printed money and devalued all the currency that's out there today. Remember, printing money, expanding the money supply, creating money into existence out of thin air is called inflation. When the money supply expands, the money that you own in your bank accounts and in your retirement and all that becomes less valuable. That's real inflation. Okay. As a result, the price of goods go up. Okay. How do you plan around that? How do you plan around digital currency if they pull that one off? And I hope they never do. I didn't move to Connecticut. We moved from Arizona to North Carolina. We're from Connecticut. We were considering going back to Connecticut because of the high taxes and because of the gun laws. The guns I own, I would be considered a felon if I brought those guns into the state of Connecticut. And this is all at the state rep level where we allow these representatives at the state level to write these crazy laws. There's just one law on the books. It's called the Second Amendment. That's it. There should be no restrictions from state to state on whether or not you own a gun. And by the way, this should have nothing to do with how you feel about guns. Okay? Because if you allow for a transgression on your rights with something you like, you will rue the day when a law is written or policy is passed that takes away something you care about. All right? Minimum wage. How can you ever be certain about what's going on with minimum wage? Again, when the government intervenes in the free market, it screws things up. It screws five more things up. You don't want the government coming in and dictating wage rates. You don't want the government coming in dictating prices, where a farmer can and cannot plant crops. Uh, Whenever the government screws with the market, they mess things up. Have not yet seen one example where that all worked out. Okay. What about DEI requirements? What about all the social engineering going on in our government today? At the state level, and at corporations for that matter. I mean, a lot of these companies are being coerced by the big vanguards of the world who own so much of our wealth. And all these, State Street, BlackRock and Vanguard, I think they own $25 trillion worth of wealth. All they have to do is go to a CEO and say, hey, look, if you don't conform to our social engineering policies, we're going to sell your stock. And as a holder of a mutual fund in any one of those companies, you don't even know that stock is gone because there's so many stocks out there that make up these funds. But when Vanguard dumps all of GE stock, let's say, if they don't comply, that's a form of blackmail. It's the same thing the Federal Reserve is doing with gun companies. Okay. This is what's going on today. You can't count on anything to plan and all that. You know, regulations. I got a very close look at regulations when I was on the board of directors for a New York Stock Exchange company, and uh, I'll give you one little example. This is a little example, by the way, because there's so many more egregious regulations that are unbelievably costly to Americans, to American corporations, which means it's also costly to you. There's a provision in the Dodd-Frank law. Chris Dodd and Barney Frank, the two co-conspirators who engineered the 2008 economic collapse. Well, these two bozos ended up now writing law to fix the problem. Kind of interesting how that works, huh? And by the way, I blame the Federal Reserve as well on the 2008 crash. But subject for another day. So Chris Dodd, who I know from Connecticut, he actually called me when my son got killed in Afghanistan, but couldn't make the funeral. He was traveling or whatever. But these two guys write this law, and one of the provisions of the Dodd-Frank law was that in your proxy, a corporation has what's called a proxy. It's like 100, 200-page document that has all kinds of stuff you have to report based on the Security Exchange Commission and all that. Well, this one number that you had to report in the proxy was the ratio between the CEO compensation and the average salary or wage rates or whatever in the rest of your company. They wanted you to report that ratio, whether it's 50 to 1, 20 to 1, 100 to 1. Why do they want you to do that? I don't know. But let me tell you something. This one number cost the company I was on the board for $300,000 of outside audit fees. And you may say, Mark, come on. And by the way, that's not counting the costs inside the company putting this stuff together. Okay. We didn't tally that up. It's probably another $300,000 when you take salaries and time and all that. Mark, come on. How can that be? Well, it's a very general law There's no rules around how you calculate the math. And when you start thinking about it, okay, let's look at the CEO's salary. Do I include his salary, his base salary? Do I include his health benefits, all the other benefits he gets? How about his stock options? How do I value his stock options? Today's price, yesterday's price, an average price? None of this is defined. How about his long term compensation? How about his retained stock? How about stock awards? How about the automobile? That's a perk. How do you value that? How do you value all this stuff to come up with that one number called CEO compensation? And then how do you come up with the average compensation for the rest of the company? We got part timers, we've got contractors, we've got exchange rate issues because people, if you're a multinational company, you've got people all over the world. So what exchange rate are you going to use to value their pay? Do you include part timers? How do you deal with salaried versus hourly? All these questions are undefined. Now you say, well, Mark, just put a spreadsheet together in 20 minutes and just calculate a number. No, because you'll have an auditor come in from the SEC or some other agency saying, we don't agree with the way you did this, and we're going to fine you because you didn't do this and you didn't include this and you didn't do that. And it all depends on who you get. See, again, no consistency at all that you can count on. So now you got to kind of cover your ass, quite frankly, to make sure that you checked all the boxes on this. This is why we end up spending all that money on this one. It's one number that goes into the proxy. A single ratio that says 48 to 1 is our ratio. Whatever the number is, right? That's a small example that I'm giving you. When you start getting into environmental policies, when you start getting into all these other DEI requirements and ADA requirements, it is massive the amount of crazy regulations that we as corporations have to go through. And you're the ones paying for it. You're the ones paying for it. Tariff policy is another one. I did a whole issue with on President Trump. I don't believe the president should be able to set policy. Not only don't I believe it, the founding fathers didn't believe it. That's part of Article 1, Section 8. That responsibility is tied back to Congress. So now you got a president going around, and by the way, I support a lot of what President Trump is doing, but I don't like the fact that it's unconstitutional. And I know there's a law passed back in the 30s that gives the president some power, but Congress can't write a law that says the Constitution doesn't apply in this case. They can't cede away their rights as a legislative branch to the executive branch. Can't be done. Same with the War Powers Act. We talked about that going to war. So all of this stuff, you start looking at everything that's going on here. How can you count on the federal government not changing every 4 years so they can plan your lives, plan your business? We should expect from our government the rule of law. It's going to be followed, even if you don't like the law. The rule of law is going to be followed. We should expect from our government to fulfill their duties to protect us as citizens. That's one of their main responsibilities. We shouldn't have to worry about letting people out of prison, letting people into our country over the border without any checks at all. We should have a reasonable expectation that certain fundamentals are in there. When the founding fathers, you heard about the Federalist Papers and there's the Anti-Federalist Papers. There was a group that, didn't want a federal government at all. Even the Federalists, they all argued how big the government needed to be and what their power should be. And there's a very fine line between the federal government and the state government. But they all fought about how the fundamental framework of our country, as outlined in the Declaration of Independence, was going to be done. They weren't arguing about the framework itself. They weren't arguing about the fact that we needed a rule of law, that the people should be in charge of the government. They didn't argue about any of that stuff. They argued about how to do it. And that's where today, I think you've got a whole different story here. You've got politicians who, first of all, and they call themselves progressives, okay, have a disdain for our Constitution. So you can't even count on a politician supporting a fundamental framework that we call the U.S. Constitution. You got people giving money away left and right. People aren't entitled to my money for health care, for education, for anything. They're not entitled to my money. And there's documentation out there that the founding fathers agree that, the government should not be a charity. So we got all kinds of violations like this going on. We got emergency spending bills. I had Paul Gosar from Arizona, congressman from Arizona, on in a previous episode, talking about emergency spending bills. The president now can spend money and bypass Congress. So I guess my message here is that we don't have a government. And I guess I titled this episode, "Do we have a government framework that we can count on?" And I don't even know why I'm asking the question, because the answer is obvious. No, we do not have a government framework that we can count on. That whatever happens today in this particular administration won't go away tomorrow with the next president. So it's a problem. It's a problem, and it's a tough one to try to get your arms around. But we need to start electing better people, and we need to start voicing our opinions to our congressmen, who are our representatives, by the way, and start pushing back on some of these items. All right. Okay. I'm going to stop there. Episode 50. Do we have a government framework that we can count on? And I think the answer clearly is no. See you next time. God bless. Thanks for listening to the Constitution Solution, one podcast under God. The Constitution is the solution to most of our country's problems. Other episodes can be found on our website at 1787solution.com, YouTube, Rumble, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and most other podcast platforms. I'm your host, Mark DeLuzio. Until next time, may God bless you, may God bless America, and may America bless God.